Hi, Beth. So even though we're at our time, we're just going to wait another minute or two and allow folks to land. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. Good day to you, no matter what part of the world you're in. This is the Tuesday tune-in, and that means that we're going to begin, as usual, with a guided meditation. And then after about 25 minutes or so of meditation, we'll transition to a Dhamma talk. I'll give a little talk, and then we'll have some time for a question and answer at the end. And please know that, as usual, although it says we're live on YouTube, that just means we're recording it there to YouTube. And so if you have any concerns about that being made public in the future, you can always contact me through the Dasanaya website. But in the meantime, we will go ahead and begin sitting. So tonight I thought we'd do just a simple meditation on the breath. And what I like to do is break it up into different steps so that you can get the process of having the mind be willing to stay with the entirety of the breath. So if you haven't muted your mic, please go ahead and do that now. And you can begin to turn your attention to the body. Just becoming aware of the weight of the body on your seat. Knowing that the bones are carrying the weight of the body.
Okay.
Allowing allowing the muscles to soften and relax as best you can. Perhaps feeling that sense of alignment of the spine all the way up through the neck and the top of the head. Resting the hands wherever it feels comfortable. And beginning to find a place somewhere in the body where you can feel the movement of the breath. Maybe it's in the nostrils or in the throat, in the chest, or all the way down in the lower abdomen. Just finding some place where it's easy to rest the mind on the sensation of the breath. And particularly noticing those pauses between the parts of the breath. No need to make them longer or shorter. Just being present for them. Receiving those moments of stillness. Noticing that the breath has its own knowing, its own rhythms. And as you become more familiar with those pauses, then you notice that they end because the next part of the breath begins. So just attending to those beginnings. And when the mind wanders off, just bringing it back to the felt sensation of the breath. Staying present for the pauses until you find the beginnings of the parts of the breath. having found the beginnings of the inhalations and the exhalations. And sustaining that attention, allowing the attention of the mind to ride along the length of the breath until you reach the pause again. Just staying receptive to the sensations of the breath. No need to change anything at all. Bringing that sense of curiosity to the moment. Beautiful. So now you can go ahead and make whatever adjustments you would like. So we can transition to the Dhamma talk. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So tonight there are a couple of things that don't often get spoken about that I want to talk about. And the first one is that tomorrow is December 7th. It is, in some parts of the world, the full moon of December. And that means that it is the day, it's Sanghamitta Day. And maybe some of you folks never heard of Sanghamitta, Venerable Mahateri Sanghamitta. She, so this is what's known as, let's see if I could get the word here, Uduwap Poya Day in Sri Lanka. So Sanghamitta Terry is, at least from what we have, as far as I know, and from what I think we have in terms of the historical record, she's the first bhikkhuni, the first Buddhist nun to actually share the Dhamma in another country outside of India. And where she shared the Dhamma was in Sri Lanka. So we have the story about her in what's known as the Mahavamsa. The Mahavamsa are these chronicles, these historical stories about Sri Lankan Buddhism. And so Buddhism arrived in Sri Lanka with Sanghamitta's brother, Venerable Tara Mahinda. And they were both the daughter and son of King Ashoka. So Ashoka was the emperor of the what's known as, I believe it's pronounced a Mauryan Empire in India. And he was quite the tough guy. He ascended to become emperor by killing 99 of his brothers when his father died. And he developed this vast empire. The Mauryan Empire was this vast consolidation of what had been many different tribal areas, or sort of what we might think of as nations, although there were not those kinds of nation states, those kind of formalized nation states in that time, which would have been about mid-3rd century BC, before the Common Era. And in any event, so he was known for a lot of death and destruction and violence and for overtaking many different peoples in many different lands. And then it said, this is now I'm talking about King Ashoka of India. of what's now called India. And then it's said that he actually felt a great wave of remorse about what he had caused, all the death and destruction that he'd caused in his life. And because of that, he sought out the counsel of the Buddhist monks of his time there. And there were said to be, according to the chronicles of Sri Lanka, millions of monks and nuns in India at that time, hundreds of thousands of which were awakened people, fully awakened arhats. And so I won't tell too much of the story about how they went forth, but in any event, the king's son becomes Mahinda, is born Mahinda, and that stays his name as a monastic, and he goes to Sri Lanka and speaks to the king there. The king of Sri Lanka at that time was Vemanang Piyatissa, sorry. And he was very impressed and took up the practice. He appreciated the peaceful nature of Buddhism, and that he thought it could help the people of his country. And so they took it up, and he was very, very supportive, and he built all kinds of monasteries and so on. And they were so impressed with Buddhism that the Queen Anula, the queen of Sri Lanka at that time, also wanted to go forth and become a nun, her and about 1,000 other women, royal women. And so they asked Mahinda if they could become monastics. And Mahinda said, well, no, you have to send for my sister Sanghamitta, because it was his understanding that a dual, or what we call now a dual ordination, was required, that it required both the nuns and the monks to ordain a bhikkhuni. And that was his understanding. Is not necessarily, that's one way of interpreting what's in the old text. There are various other ways. But for that reason anyway, they sent for Sanghamitta, and Sanghamitta said, yes, of course I'll come. And she was also considered to be an arhat. She was considered to be a fully awakened being at that point in her life. And her father, King Ashoka, is said to have cried when she said yes, she would go to Sri Lanka, because then both of his kids were gone. But he said, well, take the Bodhi tree with you. Take the Bodhi tree with you. Or one of the Bodhi trees, right? So I don't understand the botany of this, but there were trees that kept going, the original Bodhi tree under which the Buddha sat, this Ficus religiosa. That's what it is. So anyway, so Mahinda sails to Sri Lanka. So I am terrible at geography, but this much I know, that Sri Lanka is an island nation, which is just to the south of the southern tip of India. So she would have traveled through India down to take a boat over to Sri Lanka. And so there are these beautiful paintings, images of people imagining what it was like at that time as she came over on the boat, and she was bringing this beautiful Bodhi tree. And anyway, it went quite well, and many people woke up, and many people ordained, and many people took up the practice of Buddhism there in Sri Lanka. And it's a beautiful metaphor, this bringing the Bodhi tree, right? It's hearkening back to the Buddha, but it's also this beautiful metaphor of growth, bringing life, the spiritual life in this way. And this story is important for me to tell personally, because this history that Sri Lanka has of having been, again, as far as we know, the first place where the bhikkhuni lineage grew beyond India, makes them feel very affiliated with the bhikkhunis, with the nuns. So much so that they've been really tremendously helpful in the reestablishment in recent years of the early Buddhist, the Theravada form of bhikkhuni practice. So every single ordination of a Theravada bhikkhuni or seminary that I've ever been to was facilitated by Sri Lankan monks. And these guys were great because they would be like, every time I'd see them, I would say, well, hello, Venerable, how are you? And he'd say, great, we just hopped in the car and drove across country to get here for this ordination. And we're so happy to be here. And this is a lovely thing. And they would come and they would drive. Sometimes for my ordination, some of the monks drove 12 hours in 2 days in order to come to my ordination in the middle of a pandemic, mind you, my bhikkhuni ordination. So these folks have been tremendously helpful to women who are wanting to practice the Dhamma, and particularly the early Buddhist Dhamma in this form. And so we owe the Sri Lankans a debt of gratitude for many reasons, but for one reason is that they have this very strong desire to help the Dhamma to persist in the world in all its many forms, and all its many beautiful forms in the Sangha. And so the other part that I wanted to talk about is, well, how did that happen? Why was that possible? Why was all of that possible? And the reason why all of that was possible was because the Buddha woke up. So the day after tomorrow, December 8th, is what's known as Rohatsu in Japan, and in many countries, in many countries where Zen is practiced, Zen Buddhism is practiced, or Chan Buddhism is practiced, it's known as Bodhi Day, the day in which the enlightenment of the Buddha is celebrated, the 8th day of December, 8th day of the 12th month. And that's a little bit different than early Buddhism. So in early Buddhism, we celebrate the birth, enlightenment, and death of the Buddha all on one day. That all gets celebrated. They're all treated as teachings that the Buddha gave. And they're all celebrated on one day called Wesak, which happens usually in May, full moon of May. But I don't know, maybe more opportunities for cake in the Mahayana. Those 3 days are celebrated separately. The Buddha's enlightenment on December 8th, the Buddha's parinibbana, his death on February 15th, and his birth on April 8th. So what about the Buddha's awakening? I mean, he tells us quite a bit about that in his teachings. But one thing that is sort of implicit in most cases, although he does occasionally explicitly say so as well, is this idea that the Dhamma was for anyone who is willing to listen and practice it. So the Dhamma wasn't just for kings and queens who would summon a monk or a nun. Okay. Lots and lots of different types of people practiced with the Buddha in his time and with the monks and nuns of his time and in the centuries after that and millennia after that. Literally all kinds of people. We had warriors and soldiers, we had sex workers and slaves, we had royalty and people who were so impoverished that their job was to clean up old flowers and feces from the street. You had folks of presumably all the genders that presented. They were mostly just identified as male and female at that time. And we had folks of great wealth, folks of great poverty, folks of all sorts of different levels of education, knowledge, experience, folks from all different parts of the world, right? Anybody who presented. And that's important because it means that the Buddha also said that the Dhamma was for you and for me. Those of us who show up here for the Dhamma. He said that there's nothing particular about you that could possibly prevent you from following this path. Even your greatest mistakes. You know, some of you know the story of Angulimala, who was a serial killer, who the Buddha eventually spoke to, and he went forth and is said to have also awakened. So even that kind of very heavy karma, even those kinds of very heavy mistakes could be practiced with, could be transformed by this path. That is why someone like King Ashoka could take heart, even after what he had done, right? And it is why each of us can do the same. Whatever's happening in that heart mind of yours, it's something that you can bring to the path. There's no doubt about that. There is no doubt. At least there was no doubt in the Buddha's mind that if you were willing, and that is the key, right? That is the key. That we have to be willing to put ourselves on the line, to put our sense of who we are and what we are on the line, and allow that to be changed. Changed in the specifics by seeing the universal. That is the premise. That is the premise. So the Buddha was a role model in beginning with ethics, beginning by setting down harming, setting down killing, setting down lying, setting down stealing, setting down sexual misconduct, or in this case, any kind of sexual conduct, but encouraging lay folks to set down sexual misconduct. So starting out with that basic orientation to non-harming as a way of beginning to settle our minds and settle our lives on the path. And then there is the work with the mind. Then there is the work with the mind. So if the ethical part wasn't challenging enough, then you have to deal with your own inner world. And that could take some time. That could take some time, and it could be interesting. So, but part of the Buddha's story of his own awakening is that he tells us some things that didn't work and some things that did. So things that didn't work were things like forcing the mind. Right? he talks about doing meditations where he wanted to be peaceful, and so he would crush the mind with the mind and force the mind to be quiet. He said so much so that like sweat would pour out from his armpits because he was exerting himself, and he would grit his teeth. And then he said, okay, so then he wasn't overwhelmed by his feelings, but he noticed that didn't work quite well. That didn't, once you stopped exerting yourself in that way, then there's just as much dukkha, right? Just as much dissatisfaction or suffering as there had been before. In fact, I would suggest perhaps even more, right? That kind of rebellion that we sometimes feel in the mind if we try to push ourselves around. Maybe you've noticed this. If you try to sort of force particular states to occur in your meditation, that there's this kind of pushback that happens either right then or later. This sometimes manifests as feeling angry. I went through a long period of this when I was a layperson, before I had a teacher, very early in my practice. I would meditate, and it went fine, and then I would notice I was more angry after the meditation than before. Usually a sign that, yes, there's some way that I was resisting certain parts of the experience, right? Or trying to force certain states. So instead of that, what the Buddha suggested was, so after going through a period of that and going through periods of very, very strict, harsh practice with his body as well, right? Fasting and holding his breath and things like that. He finally came to realize that there was one particular ingredient that was very important, that was joy. You need to be able to find some joy in the practice. And that goes into then later on how he describes the 7 factors of awakening. And I'm not going to talk so much about the 7 factors tonight, because that's one that I have talked about with some frequency, and joy also with some frequency. Although if you have questions about joy, we can certainly go there. Since this is the happiest season of all. But what I wanted to talk about, which I don't often talk about, which is related to this, however, is that later when the Buddha also talks about what worked, so then those were the things he talks about that didn't work so well, but what did work? So joy worked in terms of being helpful, being supportive on the path. And turning the mind to look at how our actions affect our consciousness. Turning the mind to observe how our intentional actions of body and speech and thought affect our consciousness. This is really what it meant when the Buddha talks about the 5 aggregates, for example, or when he talks about the 6 sense bases, or the one that I want to share a little bit about tonight, which is the dependent origination. So dependent origination is the 3rd of the 3 forms of knowledge about karma specifically that the Buddha says he understood on the night of his awakening. So it's said to be the 12-fold chain, although the Buddha describes it in different ways in different suttas. And so, but the 12-fold chain is the most complete of them. And so if I were to put it into that context, right? So if the context is about training the mind to observe how intention plays a role in what we see in our consciousness and in our bodies, then the 12-fold chain is looking at that in different stages, you could say. So this is one of the occasions. The Buddha used a lot of different types of teaching tools. And this is one of the places where he used a teaching tool that I call milestones. So he's not drawing the whole path on the map for you. What he's doing is he's giving milestones. When this is seen, then that can be seen. When this is seen, then that can be seen. Okay? So the milestones that he presents is he starts with ignorance. And what do we mean by ignorance? So by ignorance, he means specifically our confusion about how things work. So we start out with some confusion about how things work. How compassionate? Yes, we do. Yes, we in fact do. Right? Now, mind you that he was also very clear to say, there isn't a first cause. It's not like we're trying to identify a first cause. We're talking about a thing which is very much like a spiral, like an ongoing mechanism. Okay? But he started out by saying ignorance because that was something we could relate to, right? That's part of what brings us to the path. We say, oh my gosh, I don't understand how this life works. Why is it like this? Why is it so painful? Why? Right? These are some of the kinds of questions that might bring you. Or how could it be? How could it be less painful? How could I understand a little bit better? What's the meaning of what's happening to me? There are many different ways to do it, to think about the question. But so we start out with this basic confusion, and we begin, he says, on the basis of that, on the basis of ignorance, then there is sankhara. And sankhara means what? Means mental formations, means specifically reactions and volition and volitional actions, intention. So we have reactions and we have intention. Maybe you think of it as like stories as well, or different responses that arise because of this confusion. We act out of this confusion over and over again. We make choices in our lives based on this confusion. And we can begin to observe that happens. So the example that some of you have heard me tell was that time when I was waiting for my good friend, the other residence representative, to put our 2 phone numbers up on the board, right? And I thought, when I saw that only his phone number was up on the board, I thought, hey, wait a minute. I thought we had a deal here. We had an agreement and he didn't follow it. So I got really annoyed. But then what happened was I found out from him a couple of days later that it wasn't him that had actually posted his phone number up there. Somebody else had done that. So I had a view of what had happened based on, I thought I had actual evidence, this piece of paper up there on the board that only has his phone number and not both of our phone numbers. And yet it wasn't him, actually. That wasn't the actual state of the world, the historical world or the current world. So I acted out of my confusion by approaching him, right? By confronting him. And thankfully, I didn't get much of a chance to actually tell him how angry I was because of the way the conversation went. I just was so blown away by seeing that mechanism right there, right? I was operating out of ignorance. I was operating out of confusion. And that caused this reaction. So that's the first step in the chain. And then he goes on and he says, okay, so that affects our consciousness, just as what I was saying a moment ago. Then you start to be able to observe the consciousness that is associated with these qualities. Right? So those are cognitive states that are arising, those reactions, those volitions, those intentions. So it's within the cognitive experience, and yet there is also a consciousness that can observe that can know that. that is actually sort of resonating with that, if you will. The Buddha refers to that as contact, right? When the mind knows a thought and that those two things come together with a consciousness that's attending to it, then well, you have a moment of mind consciousness. So you can start to observe the consciousness, and you can, from the consciousness, then we see the arising of name and form. So this is saying something about the way that, again, that karma works, and in terms of us engaging it with our intentional actions. So literally the teaching is what we see in the physical world, in this body and in our minds, is going to be influenced by our intentions and how we're acting and reacting in the world. Whether you take that on a moment-to-moment basis or you take it further than that, further into the lifetime, further than this lifetime. And then going on, you have the six sense bases. So again, the body. Then if you have a thought, for example, I had that thought of being angry with him about not seeing the proper phone numbers on the bulletin board there. And so then what happens? There's also a physical manifestation, right? Then there's a follow-on that we see. And I can sense that. I can sense that, clenching of the jaw or that tightening in the belly or whatever it is. That is your particular signal for the reaction that's happening or the response. And so that leads to the feeling tone, the pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral feeling tone, and how we get pushed and pulled around by this unpleasantness or this pleasantness of our lives. Wanting those things to be favorable, wanting those things to be the way we want them, the ways that are convenient for us, the ways that might be less painful for us, the ways that might help us feel in control, help us feel like who we want to be. You can give any number of shades to it. This various forms of resisting the mere fact of contact, resisting the mere fact of pleasant and unpleasant experience. And then there's this clinging, there's attachment, particularly to things that we want, particularly to, again, the pleasant, the being well, the things that help us look like, feel like, sound like, dress like who we want to be. And that is a form of becoming. That is a form of sort of development of a sense of self, which is based on things that are inherently, you could say, meaningless, actually, in terms of who you actually are, what you actually are. And ultimately, then, there is the sense of the one that is in this moment. That's one way to think about what the Buddha means by birth and the dependent origination, or you could take it more literally to mean, again, birth in terms of lifetimes and death. So all of that sooner or later comes and falls away, right? For me, it was my hair. I always thought of myself as the curly-haired girl. That was who I was. That was a very important thing. What color, and did it look good that day, and all of those wonderful things. And then eventually the color changed. And the shape of the hair changed. And I knew based on some any degree of humidity that I had no control over the hair to begin with. And then at some point, it would be gone. Not just by shaving it, but really gone. Really gone. So again, to just take this full circle, I want to say that the reason why, one of the most fundamental reasons why the Buddha could say that the Dhamma was for anyone who was willing to listen and willing to practice it is because that mechanism that we just described is right here in your life. And that capacity to observe how our intention affects our consciousness and how that plays out in this body and mind over and over again, that capacity is yours. It is right here. You can sit and observe it. You can sit and see that that's happening, that capacity for the mind knowing itself, the mind knowing the body, the mind knowing the process, the mind knowing the states, the qualities, the conditions that are present, and where they came from. And ultimately, the Dhamma will show you more of that than you can imagine. Ajahn Brahm, he's a very respected teacher out in Australia, a monk of British descent, and he says, it's like a lotus, may 1,000 petals bloom. That unfolding of what can be discerned when the mind observes itself, when the mind observes that interplay between the body and the consciousness and the volition. That is profound and subtle. And still, Buddha had great trust, great confidence in your ability to do just that, if you're willing.